Ben Purkert. How are you, buddy?
Hey, Jaime, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm super excited to talk to you today about your new book. I guess it's still relatively new.
Still new?
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk. This is a first for the program. I'm usually talking to creative directors that are still, kind of in the creative world of advertising. You have managed to escape from that world, and in a way, I'm kind of jealous of that. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about your book, which I have right here. I just finished it. The Men Can't Be Saved. And yeah, I'm super excited to talk to you about that and sort of, your journey in the world of advertising and branding. And yeah, I'm excited to get into it with you.
Yeah, I can't wait. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we dive into the book, because I got a lot of questions, give us sort of an overview of your career. Obviously, you worked at some top branding and advertising agencies, which sort of probably informed your character in your book. But sort of give the audience a little overview of your career.
Yeah, for sure. So I always wanted to be a writer. In college, I studied creative writing. I studied poetry, actually. Um, and coming out of college, I didn't know what I wanted to do for a first job. I just wanted to be a writer. I had some like Jack Kerouac naive idea of just kind of like driving around and writing or something like that. And it
Yeah.
was my poetry professor who was very unusually practical and said, Ben, like get your head out of your ass. Like you got to get a job. Um, and so I thought, okay, well, what's a job for a writer? And she was actually the one who suggested copywriting.
Wow.
I applied to a whole bunch of agencies out of college. Didn't hear back from a lot of them. And then I wound up getting a job. But part of what was so appealing to me was I got a job offer from Interbrand, if
Yeah.
you know that agency.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And part of what was so appealing to me was that the job title was not junior copywriter. It was junior creative writer, which to someone like me, like this, all I wanted to do was be an artist, be a creative. It was like, oh, this is meant to be. So I started working there in 2007. And really the job of a creative writer was more or less the same as a copywriter. It was kind of just like a smart bit of creative writing,
Yeah.
frankly, to kind of title it.
Right.
Um, but it was a wild time to be working at an agency for a couple reasons. One was that more or less like the first week I started, Mad Men came out.
Wow.
Um,
Really?
yeah. And so I kind of like instantly went from like of all my friends, I had sort of like the weird agency job, and everyone was like, well, what is that? And then Mad Men came out and everyone was like, oh my God, you're like Don Draper or something. And it
Drinking
felt,
three martinis at lunch.
yeah, right. I mean, I wasn't nearly as cool or problematic, I hope, but it was just like, if you remember, it was a cultural touchstone when that show came out for the
Absolutely. Yeah.
agency world. Um, and it felt like everyone was talking about, what it was like to work as a creative in New York. And then the next year, the Great Recession hit in 2008. And as I'm sure you likely recall, that was a brutal time for all industries, but for the agency world, it was just like those budgets got slashed.
Right.
Clients were hemorrhaging money. They didn't have money to do logos or brand refreshes anymore. They were just trying to stay above water. So I saw a ton of friends lose their jobs. I didn't lose my job, but I very easily could have. And that was sort of where the idea for the book came from was, what happens when someone gets laid off who not only needs the job to pay bills, but also like their own brand, their own identity is
Their
so
own
wrapped up
identity.
in the
Yeah.
age. Yeah, what happens? So to finish your question about, my journey. So I worked at Interbrand for about 3 years full time. Then I left to get my MFA in creative writing. I've periodically gone back and freelanced for agencies like VSA, like RGA, Siegel and Gale for a bit. But I've pretty much made that pivot. It's not really a part of my life anymore. I teach creative writing and I write books. So that's what I do.
Yeah, and so Interbrand, for folks that may not know, is more on the sort of the branding agency, right? It's more of when companies are coming to be or they're looking for a brand refresh, they might come to an Interbrand to redo everything or refresh everything, right? So it's slightly different. You're not necessarily making ads. You're maybe, coming up with a new brand mantra, or that. This is a funny part of the book where, they're constantly changing it from brand mantra to, rallying cry to, any number of, new and exciting catchphrase for it. But it is a slightly different world.
It is. Yeah. Yeah. And that, I wanted to write about that because it's true. I mean, I would freelance one week and it was a brand mantra, and then I'd come back the next week and it was a brand philosophy, and then I'd come back and it was a brand idea. And I was like, guys, isn't this really more or less the same thing?
It's the marketing. And I always talk about this, right? It's the marketing within the marketing, right? And it's like,
Right.
there's a whole other layer of that goes into just even selling through the work, right? You got to make the work itself, its own product in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the new and improved brand idea. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, we're not doing brand mantra anymore. You need the new thing. That
Right.
100%.
So, if you wouldn't mind, and because I have lots of questions about the book and the characters, but just sort of give the audience a synopsis of what the book is about, some of the main characters, and then I would love to just ask you a couple of questions, and then obviously we're gonna delve into kind of a couple of the topics that are covered in the book, which is this idea of kind of like this little bit of this toxic masculinity that kind of bubbles up to the surface in the world of advertising agencies, but also this idea maybe of creative burnout and,
Yeah.
People's identities being so closely tied to their work, right? And what they do for a living. But if you wouldn't mind, just sort of set the stage for us with an overview of the book.
Yeah, and I'll try to touch on all that. So the main character of the book is named Seth. He's in his 20s, and when we meet him, he is really riding high. The guy is full of confidence, and it's because he's had one tagline. He's sort of a one-hit wonder. He's had one tagline that's gone viral. Granted, it's for an adult men's diaper brand that no one seems to. It's like the least sexy account you could possibly get staffed on, but he has somehow made lemonade out of those lemons, and because the tagline's going viral, he's convinced that he's going to, sweep all the advertising awards. He's going to make partner. And we pretty quickly realize that his own sense of ego is pretty inflated. He gets laid off. And once he gets laid off, to your point, he's got to kind of rebrand. He's got to figure out, what do I do next? And we see him stumble and struggle. And to some extent, he grows closer to spirituality. He's Jewish. It doesn't really seem to mean much to him early in the book when he has a successful career. But when that's gone, he almost tries to rebrand himself as a devout Jew. He also gets involved in substance abuse. He chases after a couple women who more or less aren't really as interested in him. And so we see some of those toxic masculinity elements in him sort of come to the forefront, even as he, I think is going through his own coming of age journey. And part of what the book asks is, by the end, has he really substantively changed, or is it more of a surface brand level change? How deep does that really go for him?
Yeah, sort of that he just make a very surface level brand refresh, right?
Right.
And there's another character that's really interesting too, named Moon. Can you tell us a little bit about Moon?
Yeah, Moon was my favorite character to write. Moon, Moon drives Seth crazy because Moon is he's all brash. He's even though Seth is deeply narcissistic, Moon is just so much louder. Like if you watch Mad Men, he's like a younger Roger Sterling times 20. He walks into any conference room and sort of, puts his feet up on the table and just says the first thing that comes into his mind. And he's very successful. He makes partner. He's the youngest partner at the agency. All of which drives Seth crazy because he feels like he's much more deserving, and also much more neurotic. Even though he's a narcissist, he's constantly analyzing and second guessing himself. And so, Seth and Moon, to me, their relationship is really the crux of the book, because as Seth spirals and finds himself in more and more precarious situations, Moon is kind of the only friend who's there for him, even as Seth is constantly pushing him away. So that push pull of their dynamic, that was the most fun part of this, really, to write.
Yeah, and it is a friendship, but it is a really weird one, right? It's almost like how do I describe it? You mentioned sort of push pull, but they're almost frenemies in a way, but they're similar in some ways, right? They're both sort of fucked up and in their own different ways, and they kind of I don't know. It's a really strange relationship, Like at one point in the book, which is crazy. Moon drives some crazy Land Rover vehicle or something, and Seth, who at this point they're coworkers, they're sort of friends, asks to borrow it, right? And he allows them to borrow it, and then he ends up running away with it for what seems like a couple of weeks, right? Like just really a weird dynamic. How much would you say that the character Seth is based on? Is there any part of you in there? I mean, I imagine there's always a little bit of part of an author in the main characters, but do you see yourself in that character?
Oof, it's a hard question, because all the characters come from me on some level, right? On the other hand, it's fiction, so it's made up. Seth does things that I would never do. He has experiences that I have never had. Though we did work in a similar sort of agency, I would say, for sure. I mean, specifically to the Seth Moon question, I think a lot of men's relationships between straight men, can be really weird, because I think that, we can get off on this tangent or not, but there have been a lot of articles and think pieces, recently written about like the loneliness epidemic of men. Men are just, we really don't know how to be intimate with each other. We don't know how to maintain friendships, especially later in life. And so, I think Seth and Moon actually have a great deal of fondness for each other, but it's almost as if they have no vocabulary. It's like, not to give too much away, but there's a fight scene toward the end of the book, and it's almost as if like they're fighting because they're not comfortable hugging, like it's the only way for them to touch each other is to kind of just beat the crap out of each other. And I think that one thing that I did definitely observe in the agency world, the competitiveness, the power struggles, the arm wrestling that sometimes happens, not just exclusively male egos, but often male egos. And the way those power struggles can actually often be homoerotic in a certain kind of way, two men going at it for the same title or for the same
corner office
yeah, exactly. I wanted to write a book that looked at that, because I hadn't read too many contemporary books that had, and it just always it fascinated me, but it also saddened me. I think Seth and Moon would be a lot happier if they could be open about their desire for friendship with one another, because they're both very lonely.
They really are both lonely, and they're both searching for they're both searching for companionship, right? Whether it's the women that they're trying to go after, or with each other, right? And the other thing that was interesting to me about Seth was just at once he's very sort of arrogant, but like he thinks he can save everybody, right? There's another character named Ramya who's kind of a love interest, right? And in a way he's trying to save her, and he's also trying to save this other love interest named Josie, right? Like he's trying to save them with this sort of arrogance, but he can't even save himself. So it's really an interesting kind of, dynamic that he has with them, right? And they both know he's full of shit, which is funny to me.
Yeah. I mean, the book is titled "The Men Can't Be Saved," and I think you've hit on kind of one of the main ironies, which is that Seth is so preoccupied with saving others that he sort of doesn't even really know how to get himself out of hot water. And to some extent, working at an agency, I think, one of the things when I was at Interbrand, I mean, we were working all the time. And part of that is just like the churn of agency life, especially when you're junior, you're just pulling all-nighters a lot. But part of it was also when I worked there, 2008 to 2010, we were just desperate for clients, not Interbrand specifically, the entire industry. And one of the things is that when you're working all the time, you're focused a lot on your clients' problems. You're not really focused always on your own problems. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think on some level that's Seth's problem too. Like he doesn't really look inward. He's just so focused on, oh, I got to save this one. I got to save this one. I got to save this one. Meanwhile, he's living out of a friend's car, and seems to have developed like a bit of a pill addiction. He's in a bad way. He needs saving, but to even admit that would be emasculating on some level. So he can't go there.
So there was this quote here from the press release, which said, "I miss creative directors who carried themselves like golden gods, graphic designers who tore each other to shreds, copywriters who lived and breathed every comma. It was a wildly colorful place with sometimes fascinating darker side too." What is it about? What is it about this world that you think brings out all these things? I mean, we've touched on some of it, but is there some other kind of force at play that brings out all these things in people when they're working at an ad agency?
That's a really good question. And I haven't worked in other industries, right? So I can't, maybe we would get someone from like
finance
the real
or something.
estate, from finance or real estate or accounting. And that, they would say it's the exact same thing, but I don't think so. I think that there is something special, both in a really good way. Like I do miss working at an agency. It was fun and electric and communal in a way that being a writer can, it can feel lonely sometimes. I miss collaborating with designers. I really miss that. That's one of the fun things about working on the book cover was I got a chance to partner with a designer. It felt like making an ad.
Yeah.
I don't have any great insights, but I do think that a lot of folks at agencies, the creatives, are repressed artists. Some of them are pursuing their art on the weekends or in the off hours. Some of them view advertising itself as an art. Others maybe had aspirations that, logistically they weren't able to pursue because, they had to pay bills and the agency paid. And I think that sometimes like being an artist, calling yourself an artist in one's own mind gives you permission to behave badly. Do you know what I mean? Like Don Draper in the show is so brilliant at times that it's like, of course he can have a drinking problem. Of course he can treat women poorly, because it's almost like his creativity, in the same way that we think about someone like Faulkner or Hemingway or whatever, like their genius, their male genius gives them permission to behave really badly. And of course that's not ethically acceptable. It's not true. But I think that the agency world maybe hasn't come as far as it thinks it has. And certainly when I was there, which at this point is not that recent, when I was there, it was pre-Me Too. So maybe things are different at a lot of agencies. But when I was there, that aura around the male creative director who kind of just had that swagger and that vision, it was very, very much present. And it was sort of intoxicating, even as it was deeply toxic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's always been interesting to me that the creatives, especially the creative directors, are treated in a different way, right? Even the idea of just calling them the creatives, right? The creatives are off doing this. And while I'm a creative myself, to me that's really troubling, because in order to make any piece of really great work, right? A campaign, a TV spot or experiential activation, whatever, it's a whole team that's involved. Yes, the creative is very important, but you couldn't do the creative without someone on the production side bringing it to life, or somebody on the strategy side that helped point you in the right direction. But somehow the creatives have just gotten all the the spotlight, and they're sometimes, treated like you said, like golden gods, right? And it's just so bizarre to me. And I just wonder, when and if that will ever change. I've had somebody on the podcast that said, well, you have to remember that the creativity really is what an agency is selling, and therefore, sort of those people are important. And I agree with that, sort of, right? Because again, you can't put out the creative without everybody's help. But I just wonder, will that ever change or not, or is it always going to be that way, right? Where it's like, move out of the way, the creatives are coming. Oh, that's the creatives' lunch. You can't, don't touch that, or it's all, it's bizarre.
Yeah, it is bizarre. I mean, I think that it serves the agency to present their creatives in that light. Like, don't touch the creatives are working, to sort of like create an aura around it. And it is, I don't want to diminish it. I think what creatives do is really special. And in some ways it is the irreplaceable part of the campaign. But I also agree with you that it's a team effort. I mean, I think from where I sit, and I'm not trying to be moralizing about it, but I did witness some really troubling things, which contributed to me leaving the agency world. And I think that there's nothing wrong with eccentricity. There's nothing wrong with the artist, the creative who gets to wear t-shirts when everyone else has to wear suits, or, who even shows up late to meetings and has his headphones on, like, or her headphones on, whatever, right? Like, artists are weird. Artists should be allowed to be weird. But I think that eccentricity can very easily bleed into toxic behaviors that, every time that creative is late, it puts an onus on the other people in the meeting to catch that person up. Every time, the person is drinking at their desk because it helps them loosen up, someone's got to clean up the mess afterward. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a very fine line.
How much of it do you think is an affect, or sort of like, people trying to imitate what they, think it is? Because I tend to feel like, I agree with you, there are some people that just can't help it, right? That's just, they're just wired that way. They literally can't help it. And then I think I feel like there's other people who are kind of like assuming this role, right? And sort of maybe even taking advantage of some of these, ideas, right? Like, oh, I can just show up late. I'm creative, or I can blow off this meeting, right? Or like, I seem to think that there's some people that just sort of like think that that's what they're supposed to do, or hide behind it, or take advantage of it in some ways that are not fair.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And that, I mean, I think that the advertising world, like a lot of industries, but maybe specifically, I mean, faking it until you make it is a big part of the world. And that's partially what drives Seth so crazy about Moon, is he's like, there's no substance here. This guy is all show, and there's no, what is it, all hat and no cattle? Like, there's nothing really there. I think, to your point, it happens all the time, because the eccentricity is the easy part to do,
Right.
To have a really good creative idea, that's very hard. That takes real talent. It takes work. But to just, show up to work and sort of perform what a creative is supposed to look like, any decent actor can do that. Do you know what I mean? And that
Yeah.
can get you pretty far. I worked with some brilliant creatives, and I worked with some who I think, were playing a part. And sometimes the brilliant creatives were actually the most buttoned up. They weren't the people who really looked quote unquote creative.
I would tend to agree with you. And I'm trying to think back here. The people that in my opinion have been the best creatives typically aren't that person, right? The person that kicks up their feet and and walks in with headphones. Or we used to have this one client who had come from an agency and kind of fancied himself a creative, even though he wasn't. I think he was more on the strategy side. But he would drum on the table while people were like presenting, right? And Was he good at his job? I don't know. But I've found that the people that are the most brilliant usually are the ones that show up on time, that are prepared, that, yeah, sure, they have some eccentricities, but typically they're usually the more professional ones, not the ones sort of playing a part.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting. But you remember the guy drumming. You know what I mean? It's like as a
Right.
branding technique, it's a smart way to brand yourself, I suppose, because you'll never forget that person.
Yeah, maybe you're right.
Even if
Maybe
you're not,
go ahead. Sorry.
impressed. No, even if he's not necessarily impressive, at least now he's kind of like he's branded himself.
Yeah. And so maybe I have to do that. Maybe if I have to come up with some annoying. I mean, I'm sure I'm annoying in my own way. But I tend to if you took a look at me on the surface, right, it's like, okay, he's bought into some of the tropes, right? I'm like, I got a black t-shirt on, I got the big black frames, and all that stuff. But I like to think of myself as the creative that's going to be prepared, that's going to be, that's going to be a team player, that's, going to do all the things that's going to help collectively build something together. I mean, maybe somebody would tell you different, but so, if you were to turn this into, turn the book and your experience into kind of a master class for creatives or agency folks on, maybe what not to do, or what to do, or what to focus on, or pitfalls, what would you say, or what are the main takeaways that you think someone working in advertising could, take from this book and say, okay, maybe let's avoid this, or maybe let's, work on that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, for someone thinking about potentially reading the book or buying the book, it's in many ways it's a comedy, and it's also a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Here we have a copywriter who I do think is talented. He's just not necessarily as talented as he thinks he is. And I think that he, that one hit wonder thing, I think can happen to a lot of folks in the advertising world, where, you have that one campaign that hits, and it becomes your whole brand. It defines you. And we're all desperate to brand ourselves and to have identities that fill us with some amount of self-esteem. But in my experience, the agency world moves very quickly. What you did last year, starts to feel really stale pretty quickly. And some of the people who invested themselves most in the work of the agency, who looked at every tagline they wrote or every logo they designed as their art, as their baby, I think those were oftentimes the people who got hurt the most, because it made them vulnerable. I think that folks who had a little bit more distance, who recognized that while we were doing highly creative work, it was not the same as art making, that we were ultimately delivering a product to a client. Those people, I think, had longer careers and more successful careers generally. I'm not talking about like, you have to be cynical about the job to do well. I don't believe that. But I do think that if you're going into every client presentation and you've got that PowerPoint and your whole heart is in it, when the client invariably has critiques, because they always do, those are going to feel like bullets. And I think that a little bit of distance is really, really helpful for the longevity of a career.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think probably one, something that comes with time, right? Because that kind of detachment and detaching yourself from the idea, right, or not being so personally connected to it, I think comes with time, right? It's hard when you're, a creative director and you're talking to younger folks, right? And because they're really in it, they're all in it, right? And to your point, it can sometimes come across to them that, we're being cynical when we say like, hey, maybe don't take this feedback so personally, or or you agree to a change too easily, right? And the younger folks are like, hey, that was the core central idea, or whatever it is, and you feel like the old guy, the old bitter guy. But it is true, right? That you need to detach yourself, because at the end of the day, this isn't fine art. It's some form of commercial art. We're also not curing cancer, right? We're selling products. But it's hard to find that balance of being, especially as a creative director, being, realistic while still keeping, the younger creatives inspired and energized. It's sort of it can be a tough balancing act.
I think it's very hard. I think it's not just advertising. I think that um, especially people coming out of college, looking for jobs, they want jobs that make a difference, that matter, and they should, right? They want to take jobs that they care about, that they have some personal investment in. Um, at the same time, if you start to think of your job as not just your livelihood, but kind of like your reason for living, if it starts to crowd out other attentions or investments or
Right.
attachments, I think it can be very dangerous because, jobs go away, right? I mean, I lived through it. And both my parents worked for a company. They worked for the same pharmaceutical company for 50 years.
Yeah.
When that pharmaceutical company was acquired by Pfizer, they got laid off like on day one, basically.
Yeah.
Um, so I lived it in my own family. And then when I came out of college and I started working at the agency, I saw these mass layoffs again. And so I think it really, it deeply shaped me in terms of how I think about work and our relationship to work.
Yeah. Yeah. It can't be everything. And you need to detach yourself. Oh, my dog wants to get in on this conversation. Hold on.
Yeah, sure thing. You can talk to the dog. What kind of dog?
So detachment, probably a great thing for somebody to keep in mind. What about this idea of just, burnout? Because I definitely feel maybe that was part of Seth's whole experience, right? In some way, even though he was laid off, he got burned out by the process, by the politics, by the jockeying and all that kind of stuff. What would you say about burnout? Did you experience any burnout while you were working in the industry?
Yeah. First question though, what kind of dog do you have?
Oh, well, we have three.
Oh, wow.
But Mac
Okay.
is a black lab or chocolate lab mix. And then
Hmm.
we have a Chihuahua, and then we have a little wiener dog mix as well.
Hmm.
So
Oh, cute. We
yeah.
have a dog too. We adopted a terrier Chihuahua mix who was very
Oh, that's
feisty.
awesome. Dogs
Yeah.
are the best.
Uh, yes. My toddler may have other thoughts to share, but yes. Um, I, you know, I think that I was fortunate with respect to burnout insofar as I really knew that I wanted to do something else. The whole time I was working at the agency, even as I was enjoying the frenzy of it, I love, as I mentioned, I loved working with designers. That was my favorite part. Felt really electric to be in the studio. Kind of, I would change a line based on what they had sketched, and then they would change the sketch based on what I had written. It was like I really missed that collaboration. Even in spite of all of that, I knew that I wanted to be a creative writer. So I knew that I wanted to write books. That my future was not going to be at the agency. And so for me, I don't think I burned out because I was sort of detached. I mean, I don't want to misconstrue it. I worked really hard and I was invested in the work, but I didn't live it and breathe it the way that some agency folks did. So when I left, it wasn't like a Seth situation from my novel. I left with some degree of purpose. I applied to grad school and I wanted to get my master's in fine arts to become a writer. I think in Seth's case, he would say that his life was going just great. And then he got laid off and it all went downhill. I think that as the reader, we see him more clearly than he sees himself. So, even when it's kind of like someone who's bipolar. Like he's so
Yeah.
manic first page that even when he's riding high, we're not feeling comfortable because he's so invested in this ridiculous tagline for this, adult men's diaper ad, a men's diaper campaign, that something feels very unsustainable, even when things are going well. So for him, it's like, I don't know if it's burnout so much as it is just like he he's too invested, and it's going to end up poorly for him.
Yeah, and it does end up poorly for him, because he goes off and he meets he has to get a job at a coffee shop, right, which is also kind of to your point earlier about this business and many other businesses being so, I mean, it's at any moment something could change, right? At one moment you're like a hot copywriter at an agency, and then you're laid off, and now you're making lattes at the coffee shop, right? And so at any moment things can shift very quickly. And I'd lost my train of thought. I'll have to edit this out. Where was I going with that?
Well, the only thing I'll say there is, like, look, so I actually worked as a barista when I was in grad school, in part because I wanted to take a break from freelance copywriting. I was finding it very hard. Like, we talked earlier about how some folks are able to do their art and also work as creatives at agencies. I admire that. I was not able to do that. So I was freelancing at the agency, thinking in terms of taglines. I was having a really hard time doing my own creative writing because they were just bleeding together. So I thought, okay, I need to get a job. Let me get a job that is totally different, that doesn't use that part of my brain. Let me get a job as a barista and see what it's like. And listen, I don't think there's anything wrong with getting a job as a barista, but for Seth, it represents like this huge fall from grace, because I think because of the way in which he sees the world, which is largely through brands. To have this job as a successful New York City copywriter, that's a good brand. He likes that brand.
Right.
But as you say, to be making lattes, and he's got to wear this like ridiculous hat, and he's got this apron. It's like, for him, it's very emasculating. He doesn't like that brand. It's not comfortable for him. I don't think it's, neither good nor bad. It's just he has this view of the world,
Yeah. And what I loved about that whole kind of time when he's working at the coffee shop is that he and Ramya, who is his love interest, who's kind of like a wannabe designer, right? They cook up this idea that they're going to rebrand the coffee shop, and I think it's called Satma, right? Mm-hmm. And they're going to rebrand it, and that's his big. He thinks he's going to be able to, rebrand them and then take them over to the agency and have them be a new client, and they're going to reinstate him, and he's going to be back on the fast track to making partner, right? And it's just that idea, just shows how tied up he was in that whole world, right? And trying to, orchestrate this big comeback with clearly a coffee shop that wouldn't be able to afford, the fees of working with a big agency like that. It was just really like, man, this guy is really out of it. He's really, gone to a different place.
But I think, it's like, part of what's interesting to me about Seth is like, people have told me, he's such a caricature, and he is, right? I mean, the book definitely works as satire for folks who've worked in the agency world. You'll read the book, and I think that you'll see that it has a lot to say about what agencies are like, in a sort of laughable way. But on the other hand, I think, there are aspects of him that do feel pretty relatable. I can remember working on a big account. Like, I worked on the AT&T account. I worked on the IBM account. And then I would hear about a friend of mine who was starting up a business. And I would say, oh, well, you need a brand voice. You need a logo. You need a set of brand guidelines. You need this. You need experiential branding. You need this. You need that. And it's like, wait a minute. Like, I'm applying this toolkit that I've learned, and I have no sense of scale. Do you know what I mean? For my friend who's just trying to get like his LLC off the ground, these are like, he doesn't have money to think about this. These are like, 5 years down the road kinds of questions. But when you're working in an agency, I think it sort of like ingrains in you a kind of worldview.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it definitely does. You start thinking of really crazy in really sort of crazy terms like that. Like why would they're going to need this, and I would probably do recommend that they do this, that, or the other.
Hmm.
Um, what's next for you? What's on the horizon? Any more books about the advertising world in your brain?
I think so. I wrote a book of poems also, and the book of poems is called For the Love of Endings. That book has a lot about advertising in it. And obviously this novel, The Men Can't Be Saved, is really deeply situated in that world. I never want to say never, but it does feel to me like, a lot of my 20s was spent in the advertising world, in the branding world. I'm in my late 30s now. It sort of feels like maybe, these are the two books that I had to write about that. And now I'm entering a new phase of my life. I'm a parent. I'm a professor. I used to teach at Rutgers. Now I teach at Sarah Lawrence. So my life experiences have taken me further away from the agency world. So maybe I've gotten it out of my system, but you never know, right?
You never know. Yeah.
And we're currently like talking to producers potentially about adapting the novel.
I was going to
That
ask you
happen?
that. Tell us about that. Yeah.
Well, we're sort of in the thick of it. I mean, the writers' strike, if you heard about I'm sure you did, the Hollywood writers' strike,
Yep.
it sort of froze everything. And my book came out right in the middle of that. And, now my film agent is talking to folks. And so, who knows if it'll get made into TV or film? We'll see.
Yeah.
But if that happens, it'll be really fun to think about like how the agency world is brought to life visually. See, I'm talking like an agency person,
Yeah.
brought to life.
Who's going to play? I mean, what's interesting that my wife doesn't do this, which I find crazy. But when I'm reading a book, I start to picture who the characters are in terms of like, oh, I visualize this actor or that actor,
Mhm.
without putting you on the spot. I mean, do you do that? And have you thought about like who would be the best? Who could play Moon? Who could play
Yeah.
Seth or Ramya or
So my wife watches way more movies than I do, so she
yeah.
knows a lot more about, the up and coming actors. I mean, my um Jesse Eisenberg is too old probably now. He's definitely too old to play Seth, but
Oh my
that's
God, that's brilliant. I love that.
that
Okay.
that energy of like you love him but you really hate him, like he's sort of he kind of grates on you, but
Yeah.
he's charming even in the way that he's unlikable. That has always felt like Seth energy to me. Moon would be really fun to play. I mean, it would have to be someone big and loud and maybe like one of those Skarsgård guys. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like
You
who's
know
the
who
guy
I
in Succession?
pictured as sorry, go ahead.
No, the I don't know if do you watch Succession?
Yeah, I watched some of it. Yeah.
Okay, there's
Who who
one
do you
of
think?
there's there's so many great actors in that show, but there's the guy I forget his name. I think Skarsgård, the one who's like the Scandinavian investor. I don't know. Well, so you tell me who should we cast?
There's a guy and his name is escaping me. I'm pretty sure his name is Scott, and he's the son of a famous actor.
Hmm.
Um, and he's God, he's for some reason I kind of saw Moon as somebody who has like Napoleon complex. I saw him as small
Oh,
and just
interesting.
really, but good looking, right? And really, really arrogant. Scott, what's the guy's name? It's escaping me. I'll have to find it and put it on there. But that's who I saw in my mind. What is there any nervousness? Because there's always when a book gets adapted, right? They always, it's a different beast, right? So it's not a book is much different than a movie. Any concerns about what they would do with some of the characters or in the storyline? And I got to tell you just one little thing before you answer that. There was a point in reading your book where I thought that it was going to go in kind of like a Fight Club direction,
Mhm.
where I started to think, because Seth is on drugs, and I started to think, does Moon really exist? Is Moon really like some other side of him? Right? I started going down that path, and I'm like, sort of like, would they ever, are they going to make some big sweeping change like that? Or, do you have any concerns about them changing the storyline too much?
That's really cool. I've heard a couple people say Fight Club. It's interesting. You write a book and then people tell you what it reminds you of. People have said like a little bit American Psycho, a little bit Fight Club, a little bit Catcher in the Rye, a little bit Mad Men, which I love all those things. So I guess it's not weird, I guess, that I wrote something that's has a certain kinship. I mean, I think, listen, getting it made into a TV show or film would just be really cool. So I'm not going to sit here and say, I've got all these reservations. I mean, I think that it's helpful to think of it as a separate piece of art,
Yeah.
I wrote the novel. Writing is the thing that I know how to do, or at least I hope that I sort of know how to do. If you start working with a TV or a movie team, they've got different expertise.
Sure.
So I think a lot of writers are, they're very precious about their work, as they should be. They want to protect it and they want to preserve it, and they've got a very specific vision for the characters. And I think I'm more collaborative. Like we were talking about, I like working with designers and editing based on what they design. I like that back and forth. So to me, it's exciting. On the other hand, it is your baby. So,
right.
It's hard to give it away.
Yeah.
But that's why they pay you. So it's like Don Draper when he tells Peggy, that's what the money's for.
That's what, I love that line, and I've used it a couple of times when I've had to have tough conversations with the team, about stuff. It's like, that's what the money's for.
Right.
But Ben, this has been great. The book is called The Men Can't Be Saved. Final question. What is the answer? Can the men be saved? I guess you said it. They can't, but is there a world where we can be saved?
Is there a world where here's the hook. Readers have to read it and find out. Come to your own conclusions. I think I'm not hopeless. I think that the first step for some of these men, I won't say all, some of these men, guys like Seth, guys like Moon, I think that there's a good heart there. They just need to be able to sort of step back and see themselves a little bit more clearly than they do. So I don't think that the possibility of salvation or redemption is beyond them. But I think with all things, there's some work to do. But if readers read it, you can email me and tell me what you think. And if you've got thoughts on which movie stars you want to play, which characters, I will pass it along.
I love that. Yeah, this is, for anybody listening, this is, it's a great book. It's a great read. And I did, kind of feel he was so into, and I don't want to take us into another direction here, but he was so into solving this puzzle for the prostate, company, right? That I saw that as kind of like some sort of redemption hope for him, right? That he was concerned about doing something positive. So maybe that's maybe he's going to be eventually saved by that. But again, great book. Pick it up if you're obviously the people listening to this are in the business. You will enjoy it. You'll recognize characters in your own agency, I'm sure, and you'll probably visualize them as you're reading the book. But thank you so much for being on the show. Thanks for writing it and just kind of shedding some light on, the goings on at agencies and whatnot. And yeah, I can't recommend it enough. And good luck with everything. I'm hoping, I'm rooting for you that movie gets made, and maybe you'll come back on the show once it does, and we can talk about it all over again.
Oh, I'd love that. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Talk to you soon. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Hold on for 1 second. Let me just stop here.